when the Air Force was first formed out there, they had to give it some staff right away. They had professional commanders, a major general, and a lieutenant, and a brigadier general as his chief of staff. But the rank and file, the general staff officers and so on, were from a National Guard unit from Illinois or Indiana, from Indiana. And when that National Guard unit was asked to provide a cadre of officers for the staff of this Air Force, which was still an Army unit in those days, why, of course, who did they get rid of? They sent their most incompetent officers to staff the 13th Air Force. I didn't realize it at the time. I just simply reported in and met these guys. Lieutenant Colonel was the one that I was assigned to take over as Assistant Chief of Staff, A1, Personnel and Administration. And his best buddy was a statistical control officer. I learned later that those two, the only things that they were doing were writing up a history of the 13th Air Force and their imminent participation in it, in this combat zone. They're going to write a book. Well, I didn't know that, but I told him, continue doing what you're doing. I'm going to go out and visit all the field units first and get a feel for what their problems are, what I can do to help them. So I visited the 42nd Bomb Group first, a two-engine bomber group commanded by a light horse Harry Wilson, an Air Force colonel. He'd been an All-American football player at West Point when he was a cadet. But when I introduced myself and told him, you know, I was amazed. I was met with disdain and comments like, you bastards down there at Guadal, you don't know what the hell's going on. I didn't know what their problem was. All I knew was they didn't even want to talk to me. And I thought to myself, I gotta find out more about this. So I heard an announcement that there'd be a briefing at 4 o'clock in the morning for their next combat mission, bombing mission against Rabaul, an Japanese air base at the northern end of New Ireland. And I volunteered to go along. I told them I've been trained as a tail gunner, as a, turret gunner. I'd do a tail gunner or whatever. Oh, they didn't want anything to do with me. I had to go all the way. I had to go to Colonel Light Horse Harry Wilson to talk him into giving me permission to go on that raid. And I did 2 raids with them. They began treating me a little differently. And they began talking to me. And not too much directly, but all they were letting me know, I don't remember the exact conversations, was that they were getting no administrative help whatsoever from the Air Force headquarters or the Bomber Command down in Guadalcanal. Well, I went from there to either the 5th or 307th Bomb Groups, and I met the same kind of disdain in both of them. With both of them, one of them I did 2 missions with. They were both 4-engine bombers. I did 2 missions with one of them and 1 mission with the other. And then I thought, okay, it's time I get back to Guadalcanal and find out what the hell's going on. So I get into it's a huge tent-like affair, my office. And I asked my sergeant major, what's in all those footlockers over there? And he looked a little funny. I went over and opened it up, examined, and I soon learned that they were pieces of correspondence that had been initiated down in the field units, the squadrons and groups and whatnot, recommendations for promotion, recommendations for awards and decorations, commendations of all kinds, and there they were. They'd never been processed. Had just let them pile up. They were so busy writing their book. Well, I got the word to General Matheny, the commanding officer of the Bomber Command, and he told me to arrest and he fictionalized a medical evacuation slip sending him back to a rear area hospital in New Zealand. So I told General Matheny, and I guess he had somebody radio down there and told him to arrest him and hold him. He was going to court-martial him. And fictionalized a medical evacuation slip, war-weary, rotated himself back to the States. So I can still remember General Matheny dictated a long radio to the Adjutant General of the Army in Washington, summarizing all this and recommending that he be given a general court-martial. Whatever happened, I haven't any idea. But it took me forever to process those footlockers full of those recommendations. And there were some sad stories in there, like these guys in these units had been trained in flying school. Now, in those days, they had two types of commission that they gave them on completion. If they were considered officer material, having a degree in college would be one of the factors, and so on. Okay, they'd be commissioned a second lieutenant in the Air Force. If they weren't considered officer material, they were appointed as the Air Corps' equivalent of a warrant officer in the Army. They called them flight officers. I remember one case vividly, several pieces in there. This flight officer had joined the, I forget which one of the units it was, but and he had been commissioned a flight officer as a navigator, not as a pilot. Now there were different degrees of what you could be. You could be a pilot, a navigator, a bombardier, or an observer, intelligence gatherer. And he, on one of his missions that he'd gone on, the navigator of the squadron that he was flying in had been killed, and he was ordered to take over as navigator on that flight. He did a great job in leading it right up to the bomb run, navigating the plane, the lead plane that he happened to be in. And then he went on from that, he went on to being not just simply a flight of a small little group of airplanes, but a whole squadron, and then multiple squadron flights. And by now, he's a lead navigator in ever-increasing size of units. And he's such a good navigator, doing a great job. And these pieces of correspondence are described in detail what a valuable navigator he was, recommending that he be appointed as an officer. All kinds of awards and decorations, promotions and everything. They sat idle in there, and he was vacated back to the States, still a flight officer. No official recognition. I put all those together, and with a big endorsement on them, explained the circumstances, said to Washington, this is something that should be corrected.